The throne room of Aldridge Palace had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies, but never had its ancient walls contained such tension as they did on that fateful Thursday morning. King Alexander sat rigidly in his chair behind the massive oak desk that had served monarchs for generations. The evidence of Queen Dowager Camillia's betrayal spread before him like pieces of a shattered life. For 2 days, Alexander had struggled to process the devastating truth that Catherine had presented. The woman he had trusted as a mother, who had guided him through his father's death and his own ascension to the throne, had been systematically betraying everything he held sacred. The man who had always seen the best in people was forced to confront a level of deception that challenged his fundamental understanding of human nature. "I keep thinking there must be some explanation," Alexander had said to Catherine during the sleepless hours they had spent reviewing every document, every recorded conversation, every piece of evidence. "Perhaps she believed she was protecting the kingdom, that I wasn't capable of handling these complex situations." Catherine had gently but firmly guided her husband through the harsh reality that Queen Dowager Camillia's actions could not be justified as protective. The unauthorized diplomatic negotiations, the financial embezzlement, the systematic manipulation of royal communications, and the deliberate undermining of his authority were not the actions of a concerned stepmother, but of someone who had been pursuing her own agenda at the expense of the crown. The confrontation began at precisely 10 o'clock when Queen Dowager Camilla entered the throne room, summoned by a formal request from the king. She arrived with her usual composed elegance, wearing a deep blue dress that complemented her silver hair, which was arranged in the perfect style that had become her trademark. Her confidence was evident as she approached the desk, clearly expecting another routine consultation about palace affairs. "Alexander, dear, you wanted to see me urgently," Camilla said with her characteristic warm smile. "I do hope nothing has happened to interfere with your departure preparations. The diplomatic tour is so important for maintaining our international relationships." The silence that followed her words stretched uncomfortably as King Alexander studied the woman who had been like a mother to him for 15 years. Catherine stood beside him, her presence providing the strength he needed for what would be the most difficult conversation of his life. "Camilla, please sit down," Alexander said finally, his voice carrying a formality that immediately alerted her to the changed atmosphere in the room. As Queen Dowager Camilla took her seat, Catherine placed the first document on the desk, where Camilla could see it clearly. It was a copy of one of the intercepted diplomatic communications, complete with timestamps showing when it had been diverted from the king's intended recipient to Camilla's private server. The change in Queen Dowager Camilla's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The warm confidence flickered and was replaced by a carefully controlled wariness. Her eyes moved from the document to Catherine's face, and, for the first time, Catherine saw the calculating intelligence that had been hidden beneath years of maternal affection. "I'm not sure what you think you've discovered," Camilla said carefully, "but I can assure you there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for any apparent irregularities." King Alexander placed his hand on the stack of documents that represented weeks of careful investigation. "Camilla, we have evidence that you've been intercepting royal correspondence, conducting unauthorized diplomatic negotiations, embezzling from the royal treasury, and systematically manipulating palace operations for years." The accusation hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Queen Dowager Camilla's composure finally cracked, revealing the sharp anger that had always lurked beneath her refined exterior. "Evidence," she said, her voice taking on a tone that Catherine had never heard before. "Evidence gathered by your naive little wife, who doesn't understand the complexities of ruling a kingdom? Alexander, you've allowed yourself to be influenced by someone who has been in this palace for barely 5 years, while I have devoted my entire adult life to protecting this crown." Catherine stepped forward, her voice steady despite the personal attack. "Protecting the crown by stealing from it? By making secret deals with foreign governments? By undermining the king's authority at every turn?" Queen Dowager Camilla stood abruptly, her carefully maintained facade completely abandoned. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this kingdom. When your father died, Alexander, you were a grieving young man who had no preparation for the weight of the crown. The kingdom needed leadership, stability, and decisive action. I provided all of that while you learned how to be a king. By lying to me, Alexander said quietly. By manipulating every decision, every relationship, every aspect of my reign. You didn't guide me, Camilla. You replaced me. The truth of those words seemed to strike Queen Dowager Camilla like a physical blow. For a moment, the anger in her eyes was replaced by something that might have been regret, but it was quickly replaced by defiant determination. I saved this kingdom from uncertainty and weakness, she declared. Every decision I made, every action I took, was designed to strengthen Valdoria's position in an increasingly complex world. If I had to work around your inexperience and naive idealism, then that was a necessary sacrifice. General Morrison, who had been waiting outside, entered the room at Catherine's signal. His presence represented the moment when Queen Dowager Camilla's actions would face official consequences. Behind him came Lady Margaret Thornfield and Professor Whitfield, whose testimony and evidence would be crucial for the formal investigation that would follow. Your Majesty, General Morrison addressed King Alexander. Based on the evidence presented and our security investigation, I must recommend that Queen Dowager Camilla be immediately stripped of all royal privileges and access to palace communications and financial systems. The weight of the moment settled over the throne room as Alexander was forced to make the decision that would change everything. This was not just about punishing betrayal. It was about reclaiming his rightful authority and ensuring that the kingdom would be governed according to its constitution and laws rather than the whims of one person's hidden agenda. Camilla, Alexander said, rising from his chair with a dignity that showed his growth from the uncertain young man she had manipulated for so long. I hereby revoke your status as Queen Dowager, remove your access to all royal systems and privileges, and order a full investigation into your financial activities and unauthorized diplomatic negotiations. Queen Dowager Camilla's final act was to draw herself up with the pride that had always been her defining characteristic. You're making a mistake, Alexander. Without my guidance, you'll discover just how unprepared you are for the realities of ruling a kingdom. Perhaps, Alexander replied, but I'll face those challenges with honesty and integrity, supported by advisors who serve the crown rather than their own interests. As security personnel escorted Queen Dowager Camilla from the throne room, Catherine felt a profound mixture of relief and sadness. They had saved the kingdom from continued manipulation, but the cost had been the destruction of relationships and trust that had defined palace life for years. The weeks that followed brought both challenges and remarkable changes to Valdoria. King Alexander, freed from the subtle but constant manipulation that had shaped every aspect of his reign, began to demonstrate the natural leadership abilities that had been suppressed for so long. His decisions became more confident and decisive as he learned to trust his own judgment and rely on advisors who served him honestly. Catherine found herself playing a more prominent role in palace affairs, not as a manipulator working from the shadows, but as a trusted partner whose intelligence and integrity helped strengthen the monarchy. The investigation into Queen Dowager Camilla's activities revealed the full scope of her unauthorized actions, leading to the recovery of substantial embezzled funds and the renegotiation of several international agreements that had been made without proper royal authority. Perhaps most importantly, the palace developed new protocols and security measures designed to prevent any individual from gaining the kind of unchecked influence that had allowed Queen Dowager Camilla to operate undetected for so long. Catherine worked with General Morrison and other security officials to establish transparent communication systems and oversight procedures that would protect future monarchs from similar manipulation. The diplomatic tour that was supposed to remove King Alexander from the palace was cancelled, replaced instead by a series of honest diplomatic meetings where Alexander personally addressed the unauthorized negotiations that had been conducted in his name. While some international relationships required careful rebuilding, most foreign leaders respected his decision to confront the deception and work toward more transparent diplomatic relations. Queen Dowager Camilla herself faced formal charges of embezzlement and treason. The trial, conducted with all the dignity appropriate to someone who had once held such high position, ultimately resulted in her conviction and imprisonment. She maintained her defiant stance throughout the proceedings, insisting that her actions had been necessary for the kingdom's welfare. 6 months after the confrontation in the throne room, Catherine stood on the palace balcony overlooking the gardens where she had first begun to suspect that something was wrong with the carefully ordered world of royal life. The kingdom of Valdoria was stronger, more honest, and more genuinely democratic than it had been in years. King Alexander joined her on the balcony, wrapping his arms around her as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. Uncovering the truth changed everything for all of us. Catherine leaned back against her husband, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing they had acted with courage and integrity when faced with an impossible situation. "No," she said firmly. "The truth was painful, but it was necessary. A kingdom built on lies and manipulation can never truly serve its people." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine reflected on the lessons they had learned. Power unchecked by transparency and accountability would always corrupt, regardless of the good intentions with which it began. The strength of a monarchy lay not in the ability to manipulate and control, but in the courage to govern honestly and the wisdom to surround oneself with advisors who serve the crown rather than their own ambitions. The kingdom of Valdoria had survived its greatest internal crisis in generations, emerging stronger and more committed to the principles of honest governance. The crown's shadow had been lifted, replaced by the clear light of truth and accountability that would guide the monarchy for generations to come. The ancient clock tower of Aldridge Palace chimed midnight as Catherine made her way through the dimly lit servants' corridors. 3 weeks had passed since her discovery in Queen Dowager Camilla's study, and she had spent every moment since then, carefully building her case while maintaining the pretense of normalcy. Her first ally had come from an unexpected source. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the palace's head of protocol, had served the royal family for over 20 years. Initially, Catherine had approached her cautiously, but Lady Margaret's reaction to certain subtle questions had revealed that she too had noticed disturbing patterns in palace operations. "Your Royal Highness," Lady Margaret had said during their private conversation in the palace gardens, "I've been waiting for someone to ask these questions for longer than you might imagine. There are irregularities that have troubled me for years, but speaking against Queen Dowager Camilla seemed impossible given her position and influence." Lady Margaret revealed that she had been keeping her own records of unusual incidents, documents that disappeared from the king's desk only to reappear with subtle modifications, meeting schedules that were changed without the king's knowledge, foreign dignitaries who arrived for audiences that Alexander had supposedly requested but couldn't remember scheduling. "The most concerning incident happened 6 months ago," Lady Margaret explained. Ambassador Harrison from the neighboring kingdom of Northmere arrived for what he believed was a crucial negotiation about trade agreements. King Alexander was completely unaware of the meeting and had to improvise based on talking points that Queen Dowager Camilla quickly provided. The king assumed he had simply forgotten about the appointment in his busy schedule. Catherine's investigation took on new urgency when Professor Whitfield's analysis of the palace communication systems revealed the full scope of the deception. Using sophisticated monitoring equipment and his expertise in digital forensics, he had traced the intercepted communications to a secure server located in Queen Dowager Camilla's private wing of the palace. "Catherine, what we've uncovered is extraordinary," Professor Whitfield reported during their clandestine meeting in the village church. "Queen Dowager Camilla has essentially created a parallel communication system. Incoming diplomatic messages are intercepted, reviewed, and sometimes modified before they reach the king. Outgoing communications are being monitored, and, in some cases, additional messages are being sent without the king's knowledge." The professor's findings showed that Queen Dowager Camilla had been conducting unauthorized diplomatic relations with at least 4 neighboring kingdoms. These secret negotiations had resulted in trade agreements, military understandings, and political alliances that King Alexander believed he had personally negotiated, when in fact he had simply been presented with prearranged conclusions. Catherine's most shocking discovery came when she gained access to financial records through her friend Sarah, who worked in the royal treasury. The investigation revealed that Queen Dowager Camilla had been redirecting substantial sums from various royal accounts into what appeared to be personal investments and offshore accounts. "Your Royal Highness, these transactions don't make sense," Sarah explained during their careful examination of the financial documents. "Large amounts are being transferred to companies that don't seem to exist, and there are regular payments going to individuals who aren't on any official palace payroll." The financial trail led to a network of shell companies and foreign investments that had generated enormous personal wealth for Queen Dowager Camilla. She had been essentially embezzling from the royal treasury while simultaneously using her unauthorized diplomatic negotiations to secure favorable business deals for her private enterprises. As Catherine built her case, she became increasingly aware that Queen Dowager Camilla suspected she was under investigation. The Queen Dowager's behavior toward Catherine became notably cooler, and she began making subtle attempts to limit Catherine's access to certain areas of the palace and exclude her from important meetings. The situation reached a critical point when Catherine discovered that Queen Dowager Camilla was planning to send King Alexander on an extended diplomatic tour to several distant kingdoms. The tour would last 3 months and would effectively remove the king from the palace during what Catherine suspected was a crucial period for Camilla's schemes. "Alexander, do you really feel this tour is necessary right now?" Catherine asked her husband during their evening walk through the palace gardens. King Alexander, ever trusting and focused on what he believed was his duty to the kingdom, smiled warmly. "Mother feels it's essential for maintaining our relationships with our allies. She's arranged everything perfectly, and she'll manage affairs here while I'm away. It will give you a chance to focus on your charity work without the distractions of state business." Catherine realized that she was running out of time. If King Alexander left on this tour, Queen Dowager Camilla would have 3 months of uninterrupted control over the kingdom. There was no telling what irreversible decisions might be made or what additional unauthorized agreements might be established during that time. That evening, Catherine made the difficult decision to bring General Morrison into her circle of trusted allies. As head of royal security, his support would be crucial for what she was planning. Their meeting took place in the palace's chapel, where the ancient stones seemed to absorb their whispered conversation. "General Morrison, I need your help to prevent what I believe is ongoing treason against the crown," Catherine said directly, producing copies of the evidence she had gathered. General Morrison studied the documents with the focused attention of a career military man who had spent his life protecting the royal family. His expression grew increasingly grave as he absorbed the implications of what Catherine had uncovered. "Princess Catherine, if these documents are authentic, then Queen Dowager Camilla has been systematically undermining royal authority for years," he said finally. "This isn't just inappropriate influence. It's a complete subversion of the constitutional order." General Morrison revealed that his security concerns from weeks earlier had been just the tip of the iceberg. His team had identified numerous security breaches, but they had been ordered by Queen Dowager Camilla to discontinue their investigation, claiming it was unnecessary and disruptive to palace operations. "I should have pushed harder when she shut down our investigation," General Morrison said with obvious regret. But challenging the Queen Dowager's authority seemed impossible without concrete evidence. "What you've provided changes everything." Catherine's final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Prince Michael, King Alexander's younger brother who lived abroad and rarely visited the palace, arrived for what he had been told was an urgent family matter. However, King Alexander had no knowledge of any urgent situation and had not requested his brother's presence. During a private conversation with Catherine, Prince Michael revealed that Queen Dowager Camilla had contacted him directly, claiming that King Alexander was suffering from stress and needed family support. She had provided detailed accounts of supposed incidents and decisions that painted Alexander as increasingly unstable and unsuited for royal duties. "Catherine, I was actually prepared to discuss the possibility of Alexander stepping down for health reasons," Prince Michael admitted. Camilla made it sound like he was having serious problems, and she suggested that perhaps I should consider returning to take on more royal responsibilities. Catherine realized that Queen Dowager Camilla had been laying the groundwork for the ultimate consolidation of power. By convincing Prince Michael that King Alexander was unfit to rule, She was positioning herself to control a potential regency or to influence a transition of power that would leave her as the real authority behind the throne regardless of who officially held the crown. The moment of truth arrived when Catherine decided she could no longer wait for the perfect opportunity. With King Alexander scheduled to depart on his diplomatic tour in just 5 days, she knew she had to act immediately. She arranged a private meeting with her husband, armed with all the evidence she had gathered and supported by the testimony of her trusted allies. "Alexander, I need you to sit down and listen to something very important," Catherine said, her voice carrying a weight that immediately caught the king's attention. "What I'm going to tell you will be difficult to hear, but the future of our kingdom depends on you understanding the truth about what has been happening in your own palace." As Catherine began to present her evidence, she could see the disbelief, confusion, and growing anger in her husband's eyes. The man she had married was fundamentally decent and trusting, qualities that had made him an easy target for manipulation, but that would now serve him well as he faced the most difficult decision of his reign. The confrontation that would determine the future of Valdoria was finally about to begin. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Aldridge Palace like secrets waiting to be told. Inside the grand corridors, Queen Dowager Camilla adjusted her pearl necklace with trembling fingers, unaware that this would be the last morning she would wake with absolute power coursing through her veins. For 37 years, Queen Dowager Camilla had ruled the kingdom of Valdoria with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. After her husband King Edmund's death 15 years prior, she had seamlessly transitioned from queen consort to the power behind the throne, guiding her stepson King Alexander with what everyone believed was motherly wisdom. The truth, however, was far more calculated. Princess Catherine, King Alexander's wife, had always sensed something unsettling about her mother-in-law's influence. At 28 years old, Catherine possessed a sharp intellect that had been honed through years of studying political science at Cambridge before her marriage into the royal family. Unlike many who entered the palace, she had not been blinded by the glitter of crown jewels or the allure of royal privilege. Instead, she observed, listened, and quietly gathered information. The first crack in Queen Dowager Camilla's carefully constructed facade appeared during a routine security briefing. Catherine had been present, as was becoming her custom, much to Camilla's growing irritation. General Morrison, the head of royal security, had mentioned some irregularities in communication protocols that had been noticed over the past 6 months. "Your Majesty," General Morrison addressed King Alexander, "we've discovered that several diplomatic messages have been intercepted and redirected through unauthorized channels before reaching your desk. Our investigation suggests these breaches originated from within the palace itself." Catherine noticed the slight tightening around Queen Dowager Camilla's eyes, a barely perceptible reaction that would have gone unnoticed by most. But Catherine had spent years studying micro-expressions and body language, skills that served her well in the complex world of royal diplomacy. King Alexander, a gentle soul who preferred his books and charitable works to the intricacies of political maneuvering, looked genuinely puzzled. Intercepted? But who would have access to such sensitive communications? "That's what we're working to determine, Your Majesty," General Morrison replied carefully, his eyes briefly flickering toward Queen Dowager Camilla before returning to the king. After the meeting, Catherine found herself walking alongside her mother-in-law through the portrait gallery. The oil paintings of previous monarchs seemed to watch them with knowing eyes as Camilla spoke in her characteristic honeyed tone. "Catherine, darling, I do hope you're not taking these security concerns too seriously. Palace life can be overwhelming for those not born to it. Perhaps it would be better if you focused on your charitable endeavors and left the more complex matters of state to those with experience." The suggestion was delivered with a smile, but Catherine recognized it for what it was, a warning. She had been getting too close to matters that Queen Dowager Camilla preferred to keep under her exclusive control. That evening, Catherine made a decision that would change the course of the kingdom forever. She contacted her former university mentor, Professor James Whitfield, who now worked as a private investigator specializing in corporate and political fraud. Their meeting took place in the small cafe in the village below the palace, far from the listening ears of courtiers and staff. Catherine, What you're describing sounds like systematic information manipulation, Professor Whitfield said after she had carefully explained her observations. If someone is intercepting royal correspondence, they're essentially controlling the flow of information to the king. That's not just a security breach, it's a soft coup. I need proof, Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was suggesting. Something concrete that can't be dismissed or explained away. Professor Whitfield nodded thoughtfully. There are ways to trace digital communications, even ones that have been cleverly rerouted. But it would require access to the palace's communication systems, and it would need to be done without alerting whoever is responsible. Catherine spent the following weeks playing a dangerous game. She maintained her usual routines, attended her scheduled engagements, and continued to show appropriate deference to Queen Dowager Camilla. But beneath this facade, she was systematically documenting irregularities she had never paid attention to before. She noticed that certain diplomatic pouches arrived at odd hours and were immediately taken to Camilla's private office rather than to the king's study. She observed that key advisors who had once reported directly to King Alexander now seemed to route their concerns through his stepmother first. Most tellingly, she realized that several important decisions that Alexander believed he had made were actually suggestions that had been planted by Camilla through carefully orchestrated conversations. The breakthrough came when Catherine discovered Queen Dowager Camilla's private safe during a seemingly innocent visit to return a borrowed book. Hidden behind a false panel in the Queen Dowager's study was a collection of documents that made Catherine's blood run cold. There were copies of intercepted diplomatic cables, drafts of royal decrees that had never been presented to the king, and, most damning of all, correspondence with foreign officials that suggested Camilla had been conducting unauthorized diplomatic negotiations. As Catherine photographed the documents with hands that shook with both fear and adrenaline, she realized she was holding evidence of treason. Queen Dowager Camilla hadn't just been influencing royal decisions. She had been actively undermining the sovereignty of the kingdom by conducting secret diplomatic relations without the king's knowledge or consent. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside nearly stopped Catherine's heart. She quickly replaced the documents, secured the safe, and managed to compose herself just as Queen Dowager Camilla entered the room. "Catherine, what a surprise to find you here," Camilla said, her voice carrying a note of suspicion that she didn't quite manage to conceal. "I was just returning the biography of Queen Victoria that you lent me," Catherine replied, holding up the book with hands that she willed to remain steady. Such a fascinating study of royal duty and sacrifice. The two women looked at each other for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Catherine knew that Camilla suspected something, just as Camilla seemed to sense that her carefully guarded secrets might no longer be safe. "Indeed," Queen Dowager Camilla finally said. Queen Victoria understood that sometimes those who love the crown most must make difficult decisions to protect it, even if others don't understand the necessity of those choices. As Catherine left the Queen Dowager's study, she understood that the real battle for the future of Valdoria was just beginning. She had the evidence she needed, but she also knew that Queen Dowager Camilla was not a woman who would surrender power easily. The next phase would require careful planning, trusted allies, and the courage to challenge someone who had manipulated the levers of power for nearly 4 decades. That night, as she lay in bed beside King Alexander, who slept peacefully unaware of the storm gathering around him, Catherine began to formulate her strategy. She would need to move carefully and quickly because she now understood that Queen Dowager Camilla was not just a controlling stepmother-in-law, but a woman who had essentially staged a bloodless coup and had been ruling Valdoria from the shadows for years. The Game of Thrones was about to begin in earnest, and Catherine knew that the very future of the kingdom hung in the balance.